The Roman world reeled in shock at the audacious proclamations of Emperor Julian. In the space of mere months, the philosophical young ruler had utterly transformed the empire, openly embracing paganism and forsaking the Christian faith that had risen to dominance under his predecessors. His reforms were sweeping and radical. The temples reopened, the labarum removed from the standards, privileges stripped from the church. Toleration was proclaimed, but few doubted the emperor's true antipathy toward the followers of Christ. Julian's path to sole rule of Rome had been an unlikely one. Orphaned as a youth when his father and cousins were brutally cut down, supposedly at the behest of his cousin the Emperor Constantius, the bookish Julian seemed an unlikely candidate for power. Raised and educated as a Christian, he secretly harbored a passion for the old gods and the glories of Hellenistic culture. While his brother Gallus met a grim end after a cruel and incompetent tenure governing Syria, Julian bided his time, moving between the capitals of the empire and the centers of learning in Athens and Asia Minor. There, among the philosophers and scholars, he found a spiritual home, even as he rubbed shoulders with the brilliant scions of the church like Basil of Caesarea and Gregory of Nazianzus. When Julian was elevated to the rank of Caesar and sent to defend the Rhine frontier in Gaul, he proved his mettle against the odds. The Germanic hordes were defeated, Roman rule restored, Gallic prisoners freed by the tens of thousands. His star rose even as Constantius faltered in the east against the Persians. Then came the fateful day when Julian's Celtic troops, ordered east to Persia, instead proclaimed him Augustus in revolt against Constantius. A reckoning loomed between the bitter rivals. But the matter was settled by Constantius's untimely death, leaving Julian to triumphantly enter Constantinople as sole ruler in December 361. Wasting no time, he set about ruthlessly reforming the imperial court, banishing the eunuchs and sycophants. Invoking Plato's ideal, he sought to install an empire ruled by philosopher kings, replacing the bishops who had been Constantius's favorites with Neoplatonist scholars. Alexander the Great was his model and inspiration. Freedom of worship was proclaimed even as Julian made his paganism ever more explicit. The exiled Christian prelates were allowed to return, a move intended to exacerbate divisions in the church. Economic and administrative reforms aimed to strip away the church's power and turn back the clock to an idealized age of the Antonines. Only in education did he deal the Christians an overt blow, forbidding them from teaching the classics and liberal arts to the young. As the months passed and Julian's religious transformation of the empire accelerated, dark rumors spread of his ultimate designs. It was whispered that once victorious against Persia, the emperor intended a true persecution to wipe out the church for good. Holy men murmured of omens and visions foretelling doom. Away in Cappadocia, Basil and Gregory watched the developments at court with mounting alarm. Their encounters with Julian in Athens had left them impressed by his keen mind and austere manner, but wary of his inner volatility. The news now emanating from the capital seemed to confirm their worst fears about where the young philosopher-emperor's idealism might lead. He has the learning of a Plato, the asceticism of a Pythagoras, the vision of an Alexander. A formidable combination in an emperor, mused Basil as the two friends took counsel together in Caesarea. Learning and asceticism perverted to the service of the false gods, retorted Gregory bitterly. The brilliance of Apollo and the frenzy of Dionysus united in a single form, a visionary full of visions but unable to see the truth. I sensed it in him at Athens, the unsteadiness, the wild eyes, the nervous laugh. It is as much a madness as a worldview that grips him. Basil stroked his beard thoughtfully. Even so, but Julian is canny as well as zealous. His recall of the exiled bishops is shrewdly done. He knows our divisions and seeks to multiply them under the guise of toleration. The faith has weathered such storms before, said Gregory. Pray God it proves so again. But I fear Julian's ultimate designs for the church. As do I, my friend. We must be vigilant. Any chance to make our case to sympathetic ears at court must be seized. In Alexandria, Athanasius, scourge of the Arians, surveyed his newly reclaimed patriarchal throne with grim satisfaction. He had lived to see many an emperor and usurper come and go. He would outlast this purveyor of dead gods too, with the help of Christ. When the mob had torn apart George, his Arian puppet rival, Athanasius saw the hand of providence at work, a sign of divine displeasure with Julian's impious project. The emperor's bid to revive paganism would fail, as surely as night gives way to dawn. The question was how much damage he might wreak upon the church in the attempt. Whispers of disquiet passed through the imperial palace. For all the emperor's vaunted openness, an air of furtive sectarianism hung about the court. At odd hours, Julian could be seen stealing to a corner of the gardens to make secret sacrifices to Helios and the other gods. Rumors spread that he intended to be initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries and the rites of Mithras before leading his legions east. Palace servants who had served under Constantine and Constantius traded gossip about the changes they observed in their new master. He had removed the images of Christ that had adorned the palace for decades. In their place, statues of Zeus, Athena, and Serapis gazed sternly down from every niche. The imperial banquets, once heavy with meat and wine, had given way to austere vegetarian fare. Most troublingly, animals were increasingly being led into the palace precincts at night and not seen again, amid whispered reports of secret sacrifices to the pagan gods. At Antioch, where Julian assembled his forces for the Persian campaign, tensions simmered between the mostly Christian townspeople and their openly heathen ruler. The apostate, as he was now nicknamed, responded to an insult with a satire mocking the people of Antioch. The atmosphere grew uglier by the day. When Julian's uncle, a strident Christian, was hacked to death by an unknown assailant, the emperor's wrath was terrible. Though he strove to maintain his posture of philosophical detachment, the death of such a close relative shook him badly. Outright persecution it might not be, Julian's defenders insisted. The emperor's restrictions on Christians were limited to curtailing the church's privileges and keeping them from positions of influence, not active suppression of their faith. But many feared it was but the prelude to a harsher policy to come once Julian returned victorious over the Persians. Those victories, when they came, were hard-fought and indecisive. The emperor drove the Persian emperor Shapur II back from the Roman-allied kingdom of Armenia and besieged the frontier city of Ctesiphon in Mesopotamia. But the great battle all expected did not materialize. As the campaigning season wound down, Julian prepared to winter in Antioch before resuming the offensive in the spring. News reached Basil and Gregory in Cappadocia of a friend who had caught the emperor's eye amidst the scholars thronging his court. Libanius of Antioch, Julian's boyhood tutor and secret pagan mentor, saw an opportunity to broker a meeting between the emperor and a delegation of leading Christians. If they could appeal to Julian's reason, perhaps there was still a chance to halt his program to turn the empire back to paganism before it culminated in outright persecution. Basil and Gregory traveled to Antioch under the pretext of meeting with Meletius, the exiled bishop who had returned under Julian's amnesty. Meletius's Catholic stance made him a target for the reinstalled Arian bishop Euzoius, and sectarian conflict raged in the city's streets. Yet, under Libanius's protection, a clandestine encounter with the emperor was arranged one evening in the secluded garden of a sympathetic senator's villa. Julian received his unexpected guests affably enough. His Celtic secretary Oribasius was on hand to take notes on the conversation. As the emperor discoursed with the earnest young Christian scholars from Cappadocia, Libanius allowed himself to hope that some accord might be reached, that Julian might yet be persuaded back from the extremes of his religious policy before it tore the empire asunder. Despite the seemingly unbridgeable philosophical gulf between them, a current of mutual respect, even affection, ran beneath the surface. These were not intellectual lightweights but formidable advocates for their respective faiths. Julian warmed to the passion and erudition of his guests, even as they grew grudgingly appreciative of their host's austere manner and complete sincerity in his beliefs. But it was not to be. As the appointed hour grew late, the discussion shifted from amiable disagreement to ever sharper debate. Julian gestured impatiently at Basil's arguments, his wild eyes glinting in the lamplight. "You prattle of the so-called folly of the cross, the scandal of a crucified God. What sort of deity allows himself to suffer and die at the hands of mere men? I embrace the Son, eternal and indestructible, the fount of reason. Your Galilean is but a cobbled-together myth for the gullible." Gregory bristled at the implied disparagement. The very essence of our faith is a God who meets us in our weakness and mortality. A remote and unapproachable deity is no balm to the ills of the human condition. Through his suffering, Christ redeems and uplifts our fallen nature in a way your cold Platonic abstractions cannot. Julian's face twisted bitterly as he rose and paced the garden, his nervous energy palpable. Only weak and womanish minds crave such a crutch. Rome grew great through the patronage of the Olympians, each god spurring the vitality of the race that revered him. Your Christ preaches meekness and submission, sapping the manly strength the empire needs to survive and thrive. Basil sighed, recognizing the unlikelihood of making headway against such raw emotion beneath the emperor's philosophical exterior. Your Majesty, we implore you, do not proceed further down this path. Allow the Church the same freedom you grant the heathen cults. We ask toleration, not persecution. Toleration. Julian barked a mocking laugh. The Galileans had their chance under my predecessors. I have no wish for persecution, but I will not rest until the altars of the Olympians smoke with sacrifice in every city from Britain to Persia. If your Church cannot withstand open competition in the marketplace of religions, that simply proves its emptiness. Gregory raised his hands plaintively. This policy can only end in strife and division. The people have embraced Christ. They will not quietly accept this overturning of the order Constantine and his sons established. I beg you to reconsider before it is too late. The emperor rounded on them, breathing heavily. It is already too late. From the moment I first learned the glories of Hellas and the lies on which your creed is built, I knew my destiny was to overthrow it. I bid you good evening, sirs. Julian spun on his sandaled heel and retreated swiftly into the shadows of the garden, Oribasius hurrying anxiously behind. Basil and Gregory exchanged a somber glance. He will not turn back now, murmured Basil. I fear Libanius's hope for concord between throne and altar is vain. The road ahead will be hard. Gregory nodded grimly. So it appears, my friend, we must pray for strength and guidance in the trials to come. God alone knows what course the empire will take under this visionary madman before he is through. Libanius bowed his head sorrowfully. Though a pagan himself, he valued the bracing debate of faithful Christians like these erudite Cappadocians. A policy of outright hostility against such men could only weaken the empire. But the emperor was adamant. The only path now lay forward into the uncertain future Julian dreamed for Rome. The spring of 363 found Julian plunging deep into Persian territory, taking the enemy by surprise with the rapidity of his advance. First, all went well. The legions were in high spirits, emboldened by the emperor's charisma and audacity. Town after town fell to the Roman onslaught. But then came the Battle of Samara. On a dusty plain astride the river Tigris, the Romans finally met the massed forces of Shapur's army. The fighting raged from dawn to dusk. Julian was everywhere, exhorting his troops, leading cavalry charges, rallying the line where it wavered. As the sun began to sink, the Persians fell back. The emperor spurred forward in pursuit, and fell from his horse with a Persian spear lodged in his side. He was borne back to his tent unconscious, the lifeblood leaking from his wound. The Roman surgeons shook their heads helplessly. It was a mortal blow, beyond their skill to heal. Julian's eyelids fluttered open briefly, and he whispered, "You have won, Galilean," before expiring. The army was shattered by the loss of its young general. After a period of confusion, one of Julian's lieutenants, a Christian named Jovian, was proclaimed emperor. He salvaged what he could with a humiliating peace and a harried retreat back to Roman territory. The apostate's grand pagan revival had lasted a mere 20 months. The altars he had reopened were abandoned, the Galilean once more ascendant. Only Julian's writings remained to bear witness to his remarkable combination of intellectual brilliance, ascetic rigor, and visionary madness. Christian leaders breathed a sigh of relief at their close escape. What the world had witnessed was the last gasp of a bankrupt paganism, not the revival Julian had dreamed. The faith had prevailed as it always would, until the end of days. But the impact of Julian's brief, incandescent rain would echo down the centuries. In his life and death were the seeds of many a later conflict between visionary reformers and orthodox authority. The dream of reviving the glories of Hellas would never quite die, and the lure of the ruler as philosopher-king, imposing his will on the state as on a blank parchment, would tempt the powerful in age after age. In death as in life, Julian the Apostate cast a long shadow. The road to Christian hegemony in Rome, seemingly so straightforward after Constantine, had taken a last unexpected turn under his mercurial nephew. But the destination remained the same. The reign of the Olympians in the imperial court was finished, the kingdom of Christ triumphant.